Two people, both silent, both still. And somehow the silence between them is the loudest thing either of them has experienced in years. This is not the ordinary no-contact story, the one where one person pulls back and the other spirals, where the withdrawal creates a vacuum and the vacuum creates pursuit, and the pursuit confirms every fear the withdrawing person had about why distance was necessary in the first place. That story has been told, that dynamic has been mapped. This is the other story, the rarer one, the one that happens when both people, simultaneously, from completely different interior landscapes, for completely different psychological reasons, go quiet at the same time. The avoidant and the empath, the person who built a fortress against feeling and the person who feels everything, including things that do not belong to them. The person who runs from closeness and the person who runs toward it. The person whose wound says do not need anyone and the person whose wound says become whatever someone needs you to be. When these two people both go silent, when the empath for the first time in the dynamic stops reaching and the avoidant is left in the quiet they always said they wanted, something happens that neither of them predicted, and it is not what you think. Start with the empath, because the empath going no contact is the more seismic event of the two, in terms of what it ruptures and what it requires. The empath did not go quiet because they stopped feeling. The empath went quiet because they finally felt something clearly enough to act on it. Their own exhaustion, their own depletion, the specific, bone-deep tiredness of having poured consistent, generous, finely attuned emotional energy into a dynamic that absorbed it without reflection, without the reciprocal return that the empath's nervous system requires, not as a luxury, but as a basic condition of sustainability. For the empath, no contact is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling at its most directed, at its most self-possessed. The decision to go quiet is one of the most emotionally complex things an empath does, because the empath feels the other person's pain acutely, feels the avoidant's loneliness, their confusion, their unspoken need, feels all of it with the same sensitivity that made them pour themselves into the dynamic in the first place. Going silent anyway, choosing themselves in the face of the full emotional weight of what the other person is experiencing, is not the empath becoming cold. It is the empath, perhaps for the first time in this relationship, becoming whole. What happens in the empath's interior during no contact is a process that has no clean, linear shape. The first thing is relief, startling in its intensity. The nervous system that has been calibrated for the duration of the relationship to the constant work of reading, responding to, and absorbing the emotional climate of an avoidant, that nervous system, in the sudden absence of that input, exhales in a way it may not have been able to for a very long time. The hypervigilance quiets. The constant scanning. What is their mood? What does this message mean? What changed since yesterday? What did I do or not do that shifted the temperature? Goes still. And the stillness, which should feel like peace, initially feels strange, disorienting. The nervous system that has been running at a sustained high frequency does not immediately know what to do with the frequency dropping. It keeps scanning for what it is no longer receiving, keeps reaching for the input that has been removed. This is the second thing, withdrawal, not metaphorical, physiological. The neurological reality of detaching from a relationship that was intermittent and intensity-producing is not simply grief. It carries the specific quality of a system recalibrating after the removal of a substance it had organised itself around. The empath who told themselves the relationship was making them anxious discovers, in its absence, that some part of them is also patterned to miss it, to seek it, to reach in unguarded moments for the dynamic that was simultaneously depleting and activating. Holding that contradiction without resolving it into a simpler story, the relationship was bad, I am better without it, is the real emotional work of no contact for the empath. The third thing that happens in the empath is the return of themselves, slowly, in fragments at first. The opinions that were softened to accommodate the avoidance preferences, re-emerging with their original edges. The desires that were redirected around what the dynamic required, finding their original direction again. The emotional responses that were filtered through the question of how they might land on the avoidant before being expressed, arriving now into the empty space of no contact, unfiltered, raw, sometimes surprisingly intense in their original unmanaged form. The empath discovers something that the relationship had quietly obscured. They are a great deal, not in a pejorative sense, in the most accurate, most honest, most self-affirming sense. The depth of their feeling, the sensitivity of their perception, the quality of their care and their intuition, and their capacity for genuine, resonant connection. These are not problems to be managed. They are extraordinary capacities. They were simply in the wrong environment, placed in proximity to a system that could not receive them without treating them as threat. They adapted into smallness, into the rationed, careful, constantly calibrated version of themselves that the dynamic permitted. No contact returns the empath to their own full size. That return is uncomfortable at first. Full size, when you have been compressed, feels excessive, feels like too much, feels, briefly, like the very thing the avoidant seemed to find overwhelming. And then it starts to feel like home. Now the avoidant. The avoidant's experience of mutual no contact is nothing like what they expected. And what they expected, consciously or beneath awareness, was something close to relief. The relationship had been, by the metrics the avoidant system uses to assess relational experience, high activation. The empath's presence, so attuned, so perceptive, so genuinely and sometimes uncomfortably able to see past the surface presentation, kept the nervous system running its management protocols almost constantly. The amount of energy required to maintain comfortable distance with someone who could feel the distance and gently, persistently named it. The cost of that was real. So when the empath goes quiet, when the reaching stops, when the sensitive, perceptive, warmly relentless attention is no longer directed at them, the avoidant system expects to breathe. And it does, for a while. The initial experience is recognizable. The familiar quality of decompression that distance always brings. The deactivating strategies running smoothly now that there is no activation to manage. The narrative reasserting itself. This is better. This is what was needed. The relationship had too much intensity. Alone is simpler. Alone works. The system settles. The relief is real. And then, with a timing that catches the avoidant entirely off guard, something else begins. The empath's absence is different from other absences. This is the thing the avoidant was not prepared for. Previous experiences of distance, self-generated or circumstantially produced, had a quality of blankness, the absence of activation, the neutral quiet of the preferred state. What the avoidant expected, going into mutual silence with the empath, was that same quality, the blankness, the manageable quiet. What they find instead is a specific, textured, peculiarly loud absence, because the empath's presence had been so particular, so attuned, so genuinely and accurately directed at the avoidant's actual interior rather than the surface they usually manage to present. The quality of being seen, really seen, in the specific and somewhat unsettling way that empaths see, had become, without the avoidant fully registering it, a feature of their daily experience that had no precedent and has no replacement. The absence of ordinary attention is blankness. The absence of this specific quality of attention is not blankness. It is a kind of negative space that has a shape, the shape of the empath's particular perception, the exact contour of what they provided that nothing else in the avoidance environment provides. A negative space with a shape is not quiet. It is defined by what is missing. It presses against the edges of where the missing thing used to be. The avoidant begins to notice this, first as a vague sense of something off, then with increasing specificity as the recognition of what exactly is gone. The deactivating strategies begin to fail in a particular sequence. First to go is the narrative of freedom, the story that says distance is preferable, that the relationship was too much, that the quiet is what was always needed. This narrative runs out of fuel because it requires the belief that the state of the avoidant prior to the relationship was superior to the state of the avoidant during it, and the absence is now providing data that complicates that belief. The state prior to the empath was not, in fact, neutral and peaceful. It was also lonely. It was also the specific flatness of a life in which no one was seeing clearly past the surface presentation. And that flatness, which had been the default for so long it stopped registering as absence, is now recognisable as absence by contrast. The empath showed the avoidant what being genuinely seen felt like, and then they left. And now the avoidant knows what they are no longer experiencing in a way they did not know before. Second to fail is the minimization. The habitual reduction of the relationship's significance. It was not that serious. We were not that compatible. The issues were too significant. Runs up against memories that resist reduction. Not the broad strokes of the relationship, which can be framed and reframed. The specific moments. The particular instances of the empath's perception landing accurately on something the avoidant had never had named. The specific quality of warmth that was offered without invoice. The moments of ease that the system keeps returning to, with an insistence that the minimization narrative cannot fully override. Specific memories defeat general narratives. And the avoidant has, filed somewhere beneath the management strategies, a collection of specific memories whose specificity is now working against the system that is trying to process them away. Here is what happens in the avoidant's body during this period. Because the experience is not only cognitive, there is a physical component to the absence of the empath specifically, that relates to what the empath's presence was doing that the avoidant never consciously registered. The empath by nature creates a particular kind of relational environment, one in which feeling is not only permitted but held, where the emotional content of an interaction is received and metabolized and reflected back with an accuracy and a gentleness that the nervous system, even the defended one, registers as something close to regulation. The empath's presence was, at its most functional, co-regulatory. The avoidance nervous system, running its constant management, was being partially stabilized by the quality of the empath's attunement, without the avoidant knowing that stabilization was occurring. It was like background warmth from a source they never looked directly at. In the absence of that co-regulation, the avoidance nervous system is running its management protocols without the background support it had quietly come to rely on. And the difference, subtle, below easy articulation, produces a restlessness, a quality of something slightly insufficient in ordinary experience. Not dramatic, not a crisis, just the persistent, low-frequency register of something the system found valuable that is no longer available. The body knows before the mind catches up. Both people, in their separate silences, are doing something that their usual dynamic never permitted. They are experiencing themselves without the other person present as an organizing force. For the empath, this means discovering where their own feelings end and the absorbed feelings of others begin. One of the empath's central challenges, the one that made them so vulnerable to the avoidant dynamic in the first place, is the permeability of that boundary, the tendency to experience another person's emotional state as continuous with their own. To feel the avoidant's loneliness and respond to it as though it were a need they were responsible for meeting. To feel the avoidant's fear and absorb it into their own experience, carrying it alongside their own feeling until the combined weight becomes something they mistake for their natural emotional baseline. In no contact, the permeability meets its own boundary. The empath is no longer in proximity to the avoidant's emotional field. And what they discover in that separation is the startling lightness of feeling only their own feelings, of not being the receiver and carrier of someone else's unprocessed interior, of having emotional experiences that begin and end inside themselves, rather than beginning somewhere in the space between them. This lightness is revelatory, and it raises a question the empath may not have asked clearly before. How much of what I felt in that relationship was mine? For the avoidant, the equivalent discovery is different but equally disorienting. Without the empath's presence, without the attunement that kept drawing the avoidant's interior into a slightly more visible position than the management strategies preferred, the avoidant is alone with the interior in its usual defended state. And the defended state, which used to feel like equilibrium, now feels different by contrast, thin. That is the word that surfaces sometimes in this experience. The life organized entirely around self-sufficiency, around the management of feeling rather than its experience, around the maintenance of distance from anything that might require genuine emotional output. That life, which was the default and the preference and the apparent ideal, now has a quality of thinness that the empath's presence had, without announcement, been correcting for. The avoidant does not enjoy this discovery. The system was not designed to produce it and does not welcome it, but the discovery happens regardless. In the quiet of the mutual silence, in the specific experience of the absence of someone who was, despite all the management and all the defense and all the architecture erected against exactly this kind of dependence, actually mattering. What happens between them, in the silence, without a word being exchanged? Both of them are being changed by the absence of the other, simultaneously, in their separate interiors, running parallel processes that neither can observe directly, but that are reshaping something fundamental in each of them. The empath is becoming more boundaried, more self-referential, more capable of distinguishing their own needs from the felt needs of others, more willing to let someone else carry their own emotional weight without rushing to absorb it. The very qualities that made them vulnerable to the avoidant dynamic are being quietly restructured by the experience of being outside it. The no contact is doing something that years of the dynamic could not, returning the empath to themselves with enough clarity to see the shape of what they were doing and why and what it cost. The avoidant is becoming more aware, more honest, in the private space of their own interior about the reality of what they had and what the patterns that govern their behaviour in the relationship actually produced. The deactivating strategies, running in the absence of the empath, are showing their limitations more clearly than they ever did in the presence of the pursuit that kept the strategies necessary. The quiet the avoidant believed they wanted is teaching them something about the difference between solitude and loneliness that the management of distance never required them to learn. Both of them are growing, in the silence, apart, towards something. The question that eventually becomes unavoidable for both of them is the same question arriving from completely different directions. What do I actually want? For the empath, this question is about reclaiming desire from the place it had quietly vacated. The place that had been occupied for the duration of the dynamic by the avoidant's needs and the empath's responsiveness to those needs. The empath's own desires, separated from the responsibility of managing someone else's emotional world, are not immediately legible. They require excavation, patient, non-urgent excavation of what was there before the dynamic and what remains underneath the adaptations. For the avoidant, the question is about honesty, about applying to themselves the same unflinching examination that the management strategies were designed to prevent, about sitting with the possibility that what they want at the level beneath the system, beneath the defences, beneath the architecture of self-sufficiency, is not what the architecture claims it is, that the preference for distance is not the truest preference, that the thing being protected against and the thing that is actually wanted might be, in a reversal the system was never designed to process, the same thing. Connection, real connection. The specific, irreplaceable, cannot be approximated by independence experience, of being genuinely known by someone with the capacity to know them. Does one of them reach out? Does the silence break? Sometimes. And the breaking, when it comes differently depending on who initiates it and from what place in themselves the initiation comes. If the avoidant reaches out first, if the absence of the empath has done its full work, has moved through the initial relief and the deactivating strategies and the minimization and landed in the honest experience of genuine loss, the reaching carries a different quality than previous reaching. It is less managed, less calculated, less organized around the production of a specific response. It carries the specific, slightly disorienting quality of something that is happening despite the system rather than through it. The message or the call or the showing up arrives with the fingerprints of genuine feeling on it, unsmoothed, real. If the empath reaches out first, if the growth they have done in the silence has produced not the return of the old pattern, but a genuinely new orientation, one that knows what it needs and what it will not accept, and what it brings that is worth bringing, the reaching also carries something different. Not the reaching of someone who will pour themselves into whatever is offered, the reaching of someone who has returned to themselves sufficiently to know that what they bring is valuable, and what they require is non-negotiable, and what the relationship would need to be to work is something specific that they are now capable of naming. Two people reaching from genuine growth, rather than from the old configuration of wound meeting wound. That is a different beginning than the one they had. But sometimes the silence holds. Sometimes both people, in their separate processes, arrive at the recognition that the growth they are doing is growth that belongs to them individually and is not a prelude to reunion. That what they learned in the dynamic was necessary and is now complete. That the next chapter is not a return, but a continuation, in different directions, carrying what the relationship taught and leaving what the relationship could not become. That ending, quiet, undramatic, without the closure that neither person can provide to the other, because closure is an inside job, is not failure. It is sometimes the most honest outcome available. The relationship did what it could do. The silence is doing what the relationship could not. And what emerges from the silence belongs to each of them alone. What no one tells you about this specific pairing going quiet at the same time is that the silence is not empty. It is full, dense with the processing that the dynamic made impossible, with the growth that the constant activation prevented, with the self-reckoning that requires, for both of these particular people, the removal of the other as an organizing principle before it can proceed. The avoidant needed the empath to go quiet in order to feel the full weight of what the empath was. The empath needed the avoidant to be absent in order to feel the full weight of what they themselves are. Neither of those revelations was available inside the dynamic. Both of them require the silence to become possible. Two people, both still, both changing. The silence is not the end of the story. For both of them, in ways neither can yet fully see, it is closer to the beginning.